Hello everyone, welcome back to Read Along Saturday, and today we are on our last chapter of the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. So let's just start with the chapter. Chapter 3. Gregor's serious wound, from which he suffered from over a month since no one ventured to remove the apple, it remained in his flesh as a visible reminder, seemed by itself to have reminded the father that, in spite of Gregor's present unhappy and hateful appearance, he was a family member and should not be treated as an enemy. It was, on the contrary, a requirement of family duty to suppress one's aversion and to endure nothing else, just endure. If, through his wound, Gregor had now also apparently lost for good his ability to move and for the time being needed many, many minutes to crawl across his room, like an aged invalid. So far as creeping up high was concerned, that was unimaginable. Nevertheless, for this worsening of his condition, in his view, he did get completely satisfactory compensation, because every day towards evening, the door to the living room, which he was in the habit of keeping a sharp eye on even 1 or 2 hours beforehand, was opened, so that he, lying down in the darkness of his room, invisible from the living room, could see the entire family at that illuminated table and listen to their conversation. To a certain extent, with their common permission, a situation quite different from what had happened before. Of course, it was no longer the animated social interaction of former times, of the sort which Gregor had always thought about with a certain longing in small hotel rooms, when, tired out, he had to throw himself into the damp bedclothes. For the most part, what went on now was only very quiet. After the evening meal, the father soon fell asleep in his armchair. The mother and the sister warned each other to be quiet. Bent far over the light, the mother sewed fine undergarments for a fashion shop. The sister, who had taken a job as a salesgirl, in the evening studied stenography and French, so as perhaps to obtain a better position later on. Sometimes the father woke up and, as if he was quite ignorant that he had been asleep, said to the mother, "How long you have been sewing again today," and went right back to sleep, while the mother and the sister smiled tiredly to each other. With a sort of stubbornness, the father refused to take off his servant's uniform even at home, and while his sleeping gown hung unused on the coat hook, the father dozed completely dressed in his place, as if he was already ready for his responsibility and even here was waiting for the voice of his supervisor. As a result, in spite of all the care from the mother and sister, his uniform, which even at the start was not new, grew dirty, and Gregor looked, often for the evening, at his clothing, with stains all over it and with its gold buttons always polished, in which the old man, though he must have been very uncomfortable, nonetheless was sleeping peacefully. As soon as the clock struck 10, the mother tried gently to encourage the father to wake up and then persuade him to go to bed, on the grounds that he could not get a proper sleep here and that the father, who had to report for service at 6 o'clock, really needed a good sleep. But in his stubbornness, which had gripped him since he had become an employee, he always insisted on staying even longer by the table, although he regularly fell asleep and then could be prevailed upon only with a great difficulty to trade his chair for the bed. No matter how much the mother and sister might at that point work on him with small admonitions, for a quarter of an hour he would remain shaking his head slowly, his eyes closed, without standing up. The mother would pull him by the sleeve and speak flattering words into his ear. The sister would leave her work to help her mother, but that would not have the desired effect on the father. He would merely settle himself even more deeply in his armchair. Only when the two women grabbed him under the armpits would he throw his eyes open, look back and forth at the mother and sister, and habitually say, "This is a life. This is the peace and quiet of my old age. And propped up by both women, he would heave himself elaborately, as if for him it was the greatest trouble, allow himself to be led to the door by the women, wave them away, and proceed on his own from that point, while the mother quickly threw down her sewing implements and the sister her pen in order to run after the father and help him some more. In this overworked and exhausted family, who had time any longer to worry about Gregor more than was absolutely necessary? The household was constantly getting smaller. The servant girl has been let go. A huge, bony cleaning woman with white hair flying all over her head now came in the morning and evening to do the heaviest work. The mother took care of everything else. In addition to her considerable sewing work, it even happened that various pieces of family jewelry, which previously the mother and sister had been overjoyed to wear on social and festive occasions, were sold. As Gregor found out in the evening from the general discussion of the prices they had fetched. But the greatest complaint was always that they could not leave this apartment, which was much too big for their present means, since it was impossible to imagine how Gregor might be moved. Gregor fully recognized that it was not just consideration for him which was preventing a move, for he could have been transported easily in a suitable box with a few air holes. The main thing holding the family back from the change in living quarters was far more their complete hopelessness and the idea that they had been struck by a misfortune like no one else in their entire circles of relatives and acquaintances. What the world demands of poor people, they now carried out to an extreme degree. The father brought breakfast to the petty officers at the bank. The mother sacrificed herself for the undergarments of strangers. The sister behind her desk was at the beck and call of customers, but the family's energies did not extend any further. And the wound in Gregor's back began to pain him all over again. When his mother and sister, after they had escorted the father to bed, now came back, let their work lie, moved close together, and sat cheek to cheek, and when his mother would now say, pointing to Gregor's room, "Close the door, Gret." And when Gregor was again in the darkness, while close by the women, mingled their tears or, tried eyed, stared at the table. Gregor spent his nights and days with hardly any sleep. Sometimes he thought that the next time the door opened, he would take over the family arrangements just as he had earlier. In his imagination appeared again, after a long time, his boss and the manager, the chief clerk and the apprentices, the excessively dense custodian, two or three friends from other businesses, a chambermaid from a hotel in the province, a loving, fleeting memory, a cashier from a hat shop, whom he had seriously but too slowly quoted. They all appeared mixed in with the strangers of people he had already forgotten. But instead of helping him and his family, they were all unapproachable, and he was happy to see them disappear. But sometimes he was in no mood to worry about his family. He could be filled with sheer anger over the wretched care he was getting, even though he could not imagine anything which he might have an appetite for. Still, he made plans about how he could get into the pantry to take there what he at all accounts deserved, even if he was not hungry. Without thinking any more about what might give Gregor special pleasure, the sister very quickly kicked some food or other, whatever she felt like, into his room in the morning and at noon, before she ran off to her shop. And in the evening, quite indifferent to whether the food had perhaps only been tasted or what happened most frequently remained entirely undisturbed, she whisked it out from one sweep of her broom. The task of cleaning his room, which she now always carried out in the evening, could not have been done any more quickly. Streaks of dirt ran along the walls. Here and there lay tangles of dust and garbage. At first, when his sister arrived, Gregor positioned himself in a particularly filthy corner as a way of making some sort of protest. but he could well have stayed there for weeks without his sister doing the job any better. In fact, she saw the dirt as well as he did, but she had decided just to let it stay. In this business, with the touchiness which was quite new to her and which had generally taken over the entire family, she kept watch to see that the cleaning of Gregor's room remains reserved for her. His mother had once undertaken a major cleanup of his room, which she had only completed successfully after using a few buckets of water. The extensive dampness made Gregor sick. However, he lay spread out, embittered and immobile on the couch. But the mother did not escape punishment, for in the evening the sister had hardly observed the change in Gregor's room before she ran into the living room mightily offended and, in spite of her mother's hand lifted high in entreaty, broke out in a fit of crying. Her parents, the father had, of course, woken up with a start in his armchair, at first looked at her astonished and helpless, but then they started to get agitated as well. Turning to his right, the father heaped reproaches on the mother that she had not left the cleaning of Gregor's room to the sister, and turning to his left, he shouted at the sister that she would never again be allowed to clean Gregor's room, while the mother tried to pull the father, beside himself in his excitement, into the bedroom. The sister, shaken by her crying fit, pounded on the table with her tiny fists, and Gregor hissed at all this, angry that no one thought about shutting the door and sparing him the sight of this commotion. But even when the sister, exhausted from her daily work, had grown tired of caring for Gregor, as she had before, even then the mother did not have to come at all in her place, and Gregor did not have to be neglected, for now the cleaning woman was there. This old widow, whose strong bony frame had enabled her to survive the worst a long life can offer, had no real horror of Gregor. Without being in the least curious, she had once accidentally opened Gregor's door at the sight of Gregor, who, totally surprised, began to scamper here and there, although no one was chasing him. She remained standing with her hands folded across her stomach, staring at him. Since then, she would never fail to open the door furtively a little every morning and evening and look in on Gregor. At first, she also called him to her with words that she probably thought were friendly, like, "Come on over here, old dung beetle," or "Hey, look at that old dung beetle." Addressed in such a manner, Gregor made no answer, but remained motionless in his place, as if the door had not been opened at all. If only, instead of allowing this cleaning woman to disturb him uselessly whenever she felt like, they had given her orders to clean his room every day. Once in the early morning, a hard downpour, perhaps already a sign of coming spring, struck the window panes when the cleaning woman started up again with her usual conversation. Gregor was so bitter that he turned towards him as if for an attack, although slowly and weakly. But instead of being afraid of him, the cleaning woman merely lifted up a chair standing close by the door, and as she stood there with her mouth wide open, her intention was clear. She would close her mouth only when the chair in her hand had been thrown down at Gregor's back. "This goes no further, all right?" she asked, as Gregor turned himself around again, and she placed the chair calmly back in the corner. Gregor ate hardly anything anymore. Only when he chanced to move past the food which had been prepared did he, as a game, take a bite into his mouth, hold it there for hours, and gently spit it out again. At first, he thought it might be his sadness over the condition of his room that kept him from eating, but he very soon became reconciled to the alterations in his room. People had grown accustomed to discard in their things which they could not put anywhere else, and at this point, there was many such items now that they had rented one room of the apartment to 3 lodgers. Their solemn gentlemen, all 3 had full beards, as Gregor once found out through a crack in the door, were meticulously intent on tidiness, not only in their own room, but since they had not now rented a room here, in the entire household, particularly in the kitchen. They simply did not tolerate any useless, let alone any dirty stuff. Moreover, for the most part, they had brought with them their own pieces of furniture, Thus, many items had become superfluous, but these were not really things one could sell or things people wanted to throw out. All these pieces ended up in Gregor's room. Even the box of ashes and garbage pail from the kitchen. The cleaning woman, always in great hurry, simply flung anything that was moment useless into Gregor's room. Fortunately, Gregor generally saw how relevant object and the hand which held it. The cleaning woman perhaps was intending, when time and opportunity allowed, to take the stuff out again or to throw everything out all at once. But in fact, the things remained lying there. Whenever they had ended up in the first throw, unless Gregor squirmed his way through the accumulation of junk and moved them, at first he was forced to do this because otherwise there was no room for him to creep around. Later he did it with a growing pleasure, although after such movements, tired to death, feeling wretched, he did not budge again for hours. Because the lodgers sometimes also took their evening meal at home in a common living room, the door to it stayed shut on many evenings. But Gregor had no trouble at all going without the open door. Already on many evenings when it was open, he had not availed himself of it, but, without the family noticing, was stretched out in the darkest corner of his room. However, on one occasion, the cleaning woman had left the door to the living room slightly ajar, and it remained open even when the Rogers came in. As evening fell and the lights were put out, they sat down at the head of the table, where in earlier days the mother, father, and Gregor had eaten, unfolded their serviettes, and picked up their knives and forks. The mother immediately appeared in the door with a dish of meat, and right behind her the sister with a dish piled high with potatoes. The food gave off a lot of steam. The gentlemen lodgers bent over the plates set before them, as if they wanted to check them before eating, and in fact, the one who sat in the middle. For the other two, he seemed to serve as the authority. Cut off a piece of meat still on the serving dish, obviously to establish whether it was sufficiently tender and whether or not it should be sent back to the kitchen. He was satisfied, and mother and sister, who had looked on in suspense, began to breathe easily and to smile. The family itself ate in the kitchen. In spite of that, before the father went into the kitchen, he came into the living room with a single bow, cap in hand, made a tour of the table. The lodgers rose up collectively and murmured something into their beards. Then, when they were alone, they ate almost in complete silence. It seemed odd to Gregor that out of all the many different sorts of sound of eating, what was always audible was their chewing teeth, as if by the Gregor should be shown that people needed their teeth to eat and that nothing could be done even with the most handsome toothless jawbone. I really do have an appetite, Gregor said to himself sorrowfully. But not for these things. How these lodgers stuff themselves, and I'm dying of hunger. On this very evening, the violin sounded from the kitchen. Gregor did not remember ever hearing it all through this period. The lodgers had already ended the night meal. The middle one had pulled out a newspaper and had given each of the other 2 pages, and they were now leaning back, reading and smoking. When the violin started playing, they became attentive, got up, and went on tiptoe to the hall door, at which they remained standing pressed up against one another. They must have been audible from the kitchen because Gregor's father called out, "Perhaps the gentlemen don't like the playing. It can be stopped at once." "On the contrary," started the lodger in the middle, "might the young woman not come in to us and play in the room here, where it is really much more comfortable and cheerful?" "Oh, certainly," cried Gregor's father, as if he were the one playing the violin. The men stepped back into the room and waited. Soon his father came with the music stand, his mother with the sheet music, and his sister with the violin. His sister calmly prepared everything for the recital. His parents, who had never previously entered a room and therefore behaved with exaggerated politeness to the lodgers, dared not sit in their own chairs. His father leaned against the door, his right hand stuck between 2 buttons of his buttoned-up uniform. His mother, however, accepted a chair offered by one of the lodgers, Since she let the chair stay where the gentleman had chanced to put it, she sat to one side in a corner. His sister began to play. His father and mother, on one on each side, followed attentively the movements of her hands. Attracted by the playing, Gregor had ventured to advance a little further forward, and his head was already in the living room. He scarcely wondered about the fact that recently he had so little consideration for others. Earlier, consideration for his family had been something he was proud of, and for the very reason he would have had at this moment some reason to hide away, because as a result of dust which lay all over his room flew around with the slightest movement, he was totally covered in dirt. On his back and his sides he carted around with him threads, hairs, and remnants of food. His indifference to everything was much too great for him to lie on his back and scour himself on the carpet, as he had done earlier several times a day. Now, in spite of his condition, he had no timidity above inching forward a bit on the spotless floor of the living room. In any case, no one paid attention to him. The family was all caught up in the violin playing, and the lodgers, by contrast, having initially placed themselves, hands in their trouser pockets, behind the music stand, much too close to his sister, so that they could all see the sheet music, something that must certainly have bothered his sister, soon drew back to the window, conversing in low voices with bowed heads, where they then remained, anxiously observed by the father. It now seemed abundantly clear that, having assumed they were to hear a beautiful or entertaining violin recital, they were disappointed. They had had enough of the entire performance and were lying their peace and quiet to be disturbed only out of politeness. In particular, the way in which they all blew the smoke from their cigars out of their noses and mouths up into the air led one to conclude that they were very tense. And yet his sister was playing so beautifully. Her face was turned to the side, her eyes following the score intently and sadly. Gregor crept forward still a little further, keeping his head close against the floor in order to be able to catch her gaze if possible. Was he a beast that music so captivated him? It was as if the way to the unknown nourishment he craved was revealing itself. He was determined to press forward right up to his sister, to tug at her dress, and to indicate to her in this way that she might still come with her violin into his room, because here no one valued the recital as long he longed to value it. He did not wish to get her go from his room anymore, at least not while he was still alive. His frightening appearance would for the first time become useful for him. He wanted to be at all the doors of his room simultaneously and snarl back at the attackers. However, his sister should not be compelled but would remain with him voluntarily. She would sit next to him on the sofa, bend down her ear to him, and he would then confide in her that he had firmly intended to send her to the conservatory, and that if his misfortune had not arrived in the interim, he would have declared all this last Christmas. Had Christmas really already come and gone? And would have brokered no argument. After this explanation, his sister would break out in tears of emotion, and Gregor would lift himself up to her shoulder and kiss her throat, which she, from the time she had been going to work, had left exposed without a ribbon or a collar. "Mr. Samsa," called out the middle lodger to the father, without uttering a further word, pointed his index finger at Gregor as he was moving slowly forward. The violin fell silent. The middle lodger smiled, first shaking his head at his friends, and then looked down at Gregor once more. Rather than driving Gregor back, his father seemed to consider it more important for the time being to calm down the lodgers. Although they were not at all upset, and Gregor seemed to entertain them more than the violin recital. His father hurried over to them and with outstretched arm tried to push them in their own room, at the same time to block their view of Gregor with his own body. At this point, they really did become somewhat irritated, although it was hard to tell whether it was because of his father's behavior or because of the knowledge that they had just acquired. That they had a neighbor like Gregor and had not been aware of it. They demanded explanation from his father, raised their arms to make their points, tugged agitatedly at their beards, and moved back towards their room quite slowly. In the meantime, his sister, suddenly left on her own, had felt overwhelmed by the unexpected breaking of the recital. She had held onto the violin and bow in her limp hands for a little while, and had continued to look at the sheet music as if she was still playing. All at once, she pulled herself together, placed the instrument in her mother's lap. The mother was still sitting in a chair, having trouble breathing, her lungs laboring hard, and had run into the next room, which the lodgers, pressured by the father, were already approaching more rapidly. One could observe how, under his sister's practiced hand, the covers and the pillows in the beds were thrown high and then rearranged. Even before the lodgers had reached the room, she had finished fixing the beds and was slipping out. His father seemed once again to grip by his stubbornness that he forgot about the respect that, after all, he must show his lodgers. He pressed on until right in the door of the room the middleman snapped loudly with his foot and thus brought Gregor's father to a standstill. "I hereby declare," the middle lodger said, raising his hand and casting his glance both on Gregor's mother and sister, "that considering the disgraceful condition prevailing in this apartment and family, which this he spat decisively on the floor, I immediately cancel my room. I will of course pay nothing at all for the days which I have lived here. On the contrary, I shall think about whether or not I will initiate some sort of action against you, something which, believe me, would be very easy to establish." He fell silent and looked directly in front of him, as if he was waiting for something. In fact, his two friends immediately joined in with their opinions. "We also give immediate notice." At that, he seized the door handle and with a bang slammed the door shut. Gregor's father groped his way tottering to his chair and let himself fall into it. It looked as if he were stretching out for his usual evening snooze, but the heavy nodding of his head, which appeared as if it had no support, showed that he was not sleeping at all. Gregor had lain motionless the entire time in the spot where the lodgers had caught him out. Disappointment with the collapse of his plan and perhaps also weakness brought on by his severe hunger made it impossible for him to move. He was afraid and reasonably certain that they might launch a combined attack against him at any moment. And he waited. He was not even startled when the violin fell from his mother's lap, out from under her trembling fingers, and gave off a reverberating tone. "My dear parents," said his sister, banging her hand on the table by the way of introduction, "things cannot go any longer in this way. If you do not understand that, well, I do. I will not utter my brother's name in front of this monster, and thus I say only that we must try to get rid of it. We have tried what is humanly possible to take care of it and be patient. I believe no one can criticize us in the slightest." "She is right in 1,000 ways," said his father to himself. His mother, who was still incapable of breathing properly, began to cough numbly with her hand held over her mouth and panic expression in her eyes. His sister hurried over to her mother and held her forehead. His sister's words seemed to have left his father certain reflections. He sat up tight, played with his service hat with the plates, which still lay on the table from the Rogers' evening meal, and looked now and then at the motionless Gregor. "We must try to get rid of it," his sister now said decisively to his father, for his mother, in her coughing fit, was not listening to anything. "It is killing you both. I see it coming. When people have to work as hard as we all do, they can't also tolerate this endless torment at home. I just can't go on anymore." And she broke out into such a crying fit that her tears flowed down onto her mother's face. She wiped them off her mother with a mechanical motion of her hands. "Child," said her father sympathetically and with obvious appreciation, "then what should we do?" Gregor's sister only shrugged her shoulders as a sign of perplexity, which, in contrast to her previous confidence, had now come over her while she was crying. If he understood us, said his father in a half questioning tone. His sister, in the midst of her sobbing, shook her hand energetically as a sign that there was no point thinking of that. If he understood us, repeated his father, and by shutting his eyes, he observed the sister's conviction of the impossibility of this point, then perhaps some compromise would be possible with him. But as it is, it has to go, cried his sister. That is the only way, father. You must try to get rid of the idea that this is Gregor. The fact that we have believed this for so long, that in our real misfortune, and how can it be Gregor? If it were Gregor, he would have long ago realized that a life among human beings is not possible for such a creature and would have gone away voluntarily. Then we would have not have a brother, but we could go on living and honor his memory. But this animal plagues us. It drives away the lodgers and obviously wants to take over the entire apartment and leave us to spend the night in the alley. Just look, father, he suddenly cried out. He's already starting up again with a fight, which was totally incomprehensible to Gregor. His sister left his mother, literally pushed herself away from her chair, as if she would sooner sacrifice her mother than remain in Gregor's vicinity, and rushed behind her father also, excited merely by her behavior. Also stood up and half raised her arms in front of Gregor's sister as though trying to protect her. But Gregor did not have any notion of wishing to create problems for anyone, and certainly not for his sister. He had just started to turn himself around in order to creep back into his room. Quite a startling sight, since, as a result of his ailing condition, he had to guide himself through the difficulty of turning around with his head. In this process, lifting and striking it against the door several times. He paused and looked around. His good intentions seemed to have been recognized. The fright had lasted only for a moment. Now they looked at him, silence and sorrow. His mother lay in her chair, with her legs stretched out and pressed together, her eyes almost shut from the weariness. His father and sister sat next to one another. His sister had laid her hand over his father's neck. Now perhaps I can actually turn myself around, thought Gregor, and began the task again. He couldn't stop puffing at the effort and had to rest now and then. No one was urging him on. It was all left to him on his own. When he had finished turning around, he immediately began to head straight back into his room. He was astonished at the great distance which separated him from his room and did not understand in the least how in his weakness he had covered the same distance a short time before, almost without noticing it. Always intent only on creeping along quickly, he had hardly paid attention to the fact that no word or cry from his family interrupted him. Only when he was already in the doorway did he turn his head, not completely, because he felt his neck growing stiff. At any rate, he still saw that behind him nothing has changed. Only his sister was now standing up. His last glimpse brushed over her mother, who was now completely asleep. He was only just inside his room when the door was pushed shut very quickly, bolted fast and barred. Gregor was startled by the sudden commotion behind him, so much so that his little limbs bent double under him. It was his sister who had been in such a hurry. She was already standing up, had waited, and then had sprung forward nimbly. Gregor had not heard anything of her approach. She cried out finally to her parents as she turned the key in the lock. What now? Gregor asked himself and looked around him in the darkness. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. He was not surprised at that. On contrary, it struck him as unnatural that up to this point he had actually been able to move around with these tiny little legs. Despite everything, he felt relatively content. True, he had pains throughout his entire body, but it seemed to him that they were gradually becoming weaker and weaker, and would finally go away completely. He hardly noticed the rotten apple in his back and the inflamed surrounding areas, which were now entirely covered with soft dust. He remembered his family with deep feeling of love. In this whole business, his own conviction that he had to disappear was, if possible, even more firmly held than his sister's. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful reflection until the tower clock struck 3 in the morning. He lived long enough to see everything outside the window beginning to grow brighter. Then, without his willing it, his head sank all the way down, and from his nostrils his last breath flowed weakly out. Early in the morning, the cleaning woman came. In her sheer energy and haste, she banged all the doors in precisely the way people had already frequently asked her not to do. So much so that once she arrived, a quiet sleep was no longer possible anywhere in the entire apartment. In her customary brief visit to Gregor, she at first found nothing unusual. She thought he lay so immobile there on purpose and was playing the offended party. She gave him credit for as complete and understanding as possible. Since she happened to be holding the long broom in her hand, she tried to tickle Gregor with it from the door. When that was quite unsuccessful, she became irritated and poked Gregor a little. And only when she had shoved him from his place without any resistance did she take notice. When she realized the true state of affairs, her eyes grew large and she whistled to herself. However, she didn't restrain herself for long. She pulled open the door of the bedroom and yelled in a loud voice into the darkness, "Come and look! It's kicked the bucket. It's lying there. It's completely snuffed it." The Samsa sat upright in their double bed and had to get over their fright at the cleaning woman before they managed to grasp her message. But then Mr. and Mrs. Samsa climbed very quickly out of the bed, one on either side. Mr. Samsa threw the bedspread over his shoulders. Mrs. Samsa came out only in her night skirt, and like this, they stepped into Gregor's room. Meanwhile, the door of the living room, where Gret had been sleeping since the lodgers had arrived on the scene, had also opened. She was fully clothed, as if she had not slept at all. Her white face also seemed to indicate that. "Dead?" said Mrs. Samsa, and looked questioningly at the cleaning woman. Although she could have checked everything on her own, and indeed it was all clear enough even without checking anything. "I should say so," said the cleaning woman, and by the way of proof poked Gregor's body with the broom a considerable distance more to the side. Mrs. Samsa made a movement as she wished to restrain the broom but did not do it. "Well," said Mrs. Samsa, "now we can give thanks to God." He crossed himself and the three women followed his example. Greta, who did not take her eyes off the corpse, said, "Just look how thin he was. He had has he has eaten nothing for such a long time. The meals which came out again exactly the same." In fact, Gregor's body had completely flat and dry. That was apparently really for the first time now that he was no longer raised on his small limbs and nothing else distracted one from looking. "Greta, come and join us for a moment," said Mrs. Samsa with a melancholy smile, and Greta went, not without looking back at the corpse, following her parents into the bedroom. The cleaning woman shut the door, opened the window wide. In spite of the early morning, the fresh air was partly tinged with warmth. It was already almost the end of March. The three lodgers stepped out of the room and looked around for their breakfast, astonished that they had been forgotten. The middle one of the gentlemen asked the cleaning woman grumpily, "Where is the breakfast?" However, she laid her finger to her lips and then quickly and silently indicated to the lodgers that they could come into the Gregor's room. So they came and stood in the room, which was already quite bright, around Gregor's corpse, their hands in the pockets of their somewhat worn jacket. Then the door of the bedroom opened and Mr. Sams appeared in his uniform, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. All were a little tear-stained. Now and then Greta pressed her face into her father's arm. "Get out of my apartment immediately," said Mr. Sams and pointed to the door, without letting go of the woman. "What do you mean?" said the middle lodger, somewhat dismayed and with a sugary smile. The two others kept their hands behind them and constantly rubbed them against each other, as if in joyful anticipation of a great squabble which must end up in their favor. I mean exactly what I said, replied Mr. Samsa, and with his two female companions went directly up to the lodger. The latter at first stood there motionless and looked at the floor, as if matters were arranging themselves in a new way in his head. All right, then we'll go, he said and looked up at Mr. Samsa as if suddenly overcome by humility. He was even asking fresh permission for this discussion. Mr. Samsa merely nodded briefly and repeated to him with his eyes wide open. Following that, with long strides, the lodger did actually go out into the hall. His two friends had already been listening for a while with their hands quite still, and now they hopped smartly after him, as if afraid that Mr. Samsa could step into the hall ahead of them and disturb their reunion with their leader. In the hall, all three of them took their hats from the coat rack, pulled their canes from the umbrella stand, bowed silently, and left the apartment. In what turned out to be an entirely groundless mistrust, Mr. Samsa stepped with the two women out onto the landing, leaned against the railing, and looked over the three lodgers slowly but steadily made their way down to this long staircase, disappeared on each floor in a certain turn of the stairwell, and in a few seconds reappeared again. The further down they went, the more the Samson family lost interest in them, and when the butcher's assistant with a tray on his head came to meet them, then, with a proud bearing, ascended the stairs high above them. Mr. Samsa, together with the women, soon left the banister, and they all returned, as if relieved, back into their apartment. They decided to pass the day resting and going for a stroll. Not only had they earned their break from work, but there was no question that they really needed it. And so they sat down on the table and wrote three letters of apology. Mr. Samsa to his supervisor, Mrs. Samsa to her client, and Greta to her proprietor. During the writing, the cleaning woman came in to say that she was going off, for her morning work was finished. The three people writing at first merely nodded and without glancing up. Only when the cleaning woman was still unwilling to depart did they look up annoyed. Well? Asked Mr. Samsa. The cleaning woman stood smiling in the doorway as if she had a great stroke of luck to report to the family, but would only do it if she was questioned thoroughly. The almost upright small ostrich feather in her hat, which had irritated Mr. Samsa during her entire service with them, swayed slightly in all directions. All right then, what do you really want? Asked Mrs. Samsa, whom the cleaning lady respected more than the others. Well, answered the cleaning lady, smiling so happily she couldn't go on speaking right away. You mustn't worry about throwing out the rubbish from the next room. It's all taken care of. Mrs. Samsa and Greta bent down to their letters as though they wanted to go on writing. Mr. Samsa, who saw that the cleaning lady would now want to describe everything in detail, decisively prevented her with an outstretched hand. Since she was not allowed to explain, she remembered the great hurry she was in and called out, clearly insulted, Bye bye, everyone, then turned around furiously and left the apartment with a fearful slamming of the door. This evening she'll be given notice, said Mr. Samsa, but he got no answer from either his wife or from his daughter because the cleaning woman seemed to have once again upset the tranquility they've just attained. The women got up, went to the window, remained there with their arms about each other. Mr. Samsa turned around in his chair in the direction and observed them quietly for a while. Then he called out, All right, come here then. Let's set aside these old matters once and for all and have a little consideration for me. The women attended to him at once. They rushed to him, caressed him, and quickly ended their letters. Then all three left the apartment together, something they had not done for months now, and took the electric tram into the open air outside the city. The car in which they were sitting by themselves was wholly flooded by warm sun. Leaning back comfortably in their seats, they talked to each other about future prospects, and they discovered that on closer observation, these were not at all bad, for the three of them had not really questioned each other about their employment at all. Each of their positions was extremely favorable and offered specially promising future prospects. The greatest improvement in their situation at this point, of course, would have to come from the change of dwelling. They would now like to rent a smaller and cheaper apartment, but better situated and generally more practical than the present one, which Gregor had chosen. While they amused themselves chatting in this way, it struck Mr. and Mrs. Samsa almost at the same time as they looked at the daughter, who was getting more animated all the time. Now had blossomed recently, in spite of all the troubles which had her cheeks pale, into a beautiful and voluptuous young woman. Growing more silent and almost unconsciously understanding each other in their glances, they thought that the time has now come to hand to seek out a good, honest man for her. And it was something of confirmation from their new dreams and good intentions when, at the end of their journey, their daughter stood up first and stretched her young body. Okay, so that was the end of Metamorphosis and the closing of this Read Along Saturday series for this particular book. Next week, I am going to see you with another book, and I have actually not yet decided which one is that. So let me think over it, and you are welcome to give your suggestions in the comments below which copyright free book I should read in the Read Along Saturday next. So the Metamorphosis is available on Prime Reading on Kindle. So if you have Amazon Prime and a Kindle, then you can read this book for free. And it is also available in many formats on Amazon itself. So until next time, keep watching and keep reading.